Yeah. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to give an overview of what the group was about, how it came about, what we did, and a little bit about the process of bringing things together. Then what you'll find contained in the output. And then at the end of my little bit here, I'll also mention some of the other kind of extensions or dissemination efforts or other pieces of work that have come out of this, because it's actually had quite a few. When I was looking to update things in the last few days, I was surprised to see how many more things had appeared. So in terms of the background of the group, this was actually a request from the European Commission to the Research Data Alliance, essentially saying, could you use your, what are now, I think, relatively vast resources in terms of pools of experts around the world to put together some guidelines around data sharing under COVID-19. So this request came in April or March, I think, actually. And RDA responded quite rapidly. And again, this is this was done in a very different kind of way, because normally the request for a working group doesn't come from the European Commission. Normally, people within RDA decide to put together a group. So this was a slightly different approach. But as soon as that request was made, then the working group was put together in the same kind of grassroots way as it normally is, with people volunteering and getting involved. So the working group was set up with a number of subgroups because the topics are quite vast. 4 different research areas, which I'll show you, and then 4 what we call cross-cutting themes. So areas of inquiry that needed to be addressed in terms of sharing COVID-19 data, but cut across the different areas of research that are being conducted directly on COVID-19 or on the spread of COVID-19. So those were set up quite quickly. And then we structured it through a series of teams. I won't say too much about this because I think you'll get a little bit more around this from Louise, but there were a number of co-chairs. Mark's introduced some of those, moderators for each of the groups and co-moderators. There was an editorial team that tried to pull all these different pieces together, a visualization team to work on that side of thing, and a Zotero library team to put together all of the references, which are actually quite extensive for the document. And so between April 1st and June 30th, there were continual sprints. And part of what we did is had releases. There were 6 releases in the end at a pretty slightly brain-shattering pace at one point there. I think people on the group will agree. Every week there was a new draft coming out, being opened for consultation. We would then take that feedback and incorporate it, while at the same time the groups were working on their next draft. So very iterative process, intense sprints. We had webinars every week to keep one another up to date on what was happening. And in the end, at the end of June, we put out the final document. It's 143 pages long. There is a 4-page executive summary, which is a slightly faster read there, and an infographic and lots of other outputs, which I'll talk about later. But really, it was an exhausting and an exhilarating process. I know that I think I share the sentiment that many of us were feeling the desire to contribute in some way to what was going on with the pandemic. And, you know, it's nice when you can bring together some aspects of your work, you know, to be able to do that. I don't have any kind of background in the medical field, but it, of course, was interesting, and the data side was something I felt I could contribute to. So from a personal perspective, really interesting group to get involved in this moment. Okay, so what is it we were trying to do? Well, in the when it comes right down to it, basically speaking, under COVID-19, as with many other health emergencies, but in particular this one, there's an absolutely critical need for sharing the data that's produced out of research rapidly, for sharing all research outputs, but you know, with our focus at RDA, the focus on the data side and software and other supporting outputs besides the publications. Need to happen for this to happen really quickly, but for it to happen really quickly, there's a danger of that sharing happening in ways that don't facilitate better reuse, right? So there's a balance that had to be struck between timeliness and precision of outputs. So that was one of the challenges. But the kind of complementary or other challenge to come with this is that we don't have harmonized or universal standards for sharing these kinds of data. And the data themselves are quite diverse depending on what area you're looking at, right? Systems aren't necessarily up to date. and collecting, documenting, disseminating, all of these things. We have pathways, and I think that's one of the realizations of this group is we have so many of these pieces already in place, but they're not necessarily connected. So what can we do to connect those things? The objectives, we've got a number of them listed here, but really I'd boil them down to kind of two main sides of things we were asked to do. One side was to create recommendations, and these are at a higher level for funders, for governments trying to address the pandemic, to look at things in a more systemic way. What are the larger sorts of supports that are required at a policy level to help facilitate better data sharing under COVID-19? So that was one side of it. And then the other side were guidelines for researchers, for clinicians, for data stewards that are actually using data or producing data around COVID-19 research. How can they better facilitate data sharing in a timely and a precise way? And that side of things was a much more precise effort. So I'm going to give you some examples in a moment. So here is a kind of diagram that shows you the different groups that we had, or subgroups that were under the COVID-19 working group. The 4 research areas are at the top, so clinical, omics, epidemiology, and social sciences. And they got to work looking in their own variety of domains, sometimes within each of these areas, to produce both the recommendations and guidelines. Those recommendations and guidelines that I mentioned before go across all of the groups. And then we also had these 4 areas. One on community practice and sort of involvement around contact tracing apps or patient data, so community connection side of things. Then also around research software. This topic, I think, is being raised more and more, or more vocally in the last while, which I think is really important. Data is produced, but it's also analyzed, and it's also thrown through different kinds of software and algorithms, and we need to know what those are in order to be able to interpret and reuse. So what do we do in terms of sharing research software outputs as well? There's a section on Indigenous data guidelines, what to take into consideration around data that is either collected from Indigenous communities or used by Indigenous communities. So this is really around sovereignty issues. And great connection happened there because we got working with the group from GIDA, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, on this particular section. And then the last but not least, because it was so essential to so many areas, was the group that was working on legal and ethical considerations. And this could be anything from privacy to licensing of data to consent, and those kinds of things. So cross-cutting over all of these different areas. And just to give you a sense of what the granular, detailed side of things look like, if we take a look at omics, for example, here's literally a page out of those 143 pages. They don't all look like this. This is a really an exemplar, I think, of the specificity that you can get to if you bring together all of these people that have knowledge from different areas. So right here, this is a very specific section. So it's one of the omics, genomics, and where should you put that data? What repositories should you use? And this here you can see describes or gives direct links to suitable repositories for depositing different data types for host genomics data. And then if we take a look at a page right out of the legal and ethical considerations, here's a good example here of what you see. So this is the section, just one of many, on consent. Okay, so what should happen around patient consent? Not only to be ethical, but also to, which is important, of course, in its own right, but also to ensure that the data that's collected can be used downstream. So there may be other uses for this data in the future. Probably not the last pandemic we're going to face, as we're all, quite conscious of, I think, in this round. So what sorts of considerations should we put into play here? So that gives you a kind of taste of it. And then the last thing I'll say about the report itself, before I go on to some of the other outputs that we've had, is that, and this was really the task, I guess, of partly of the editorial team, was to look across all of these different areas and say, it looks like there's some common themes coming up. There's some repetition on some of the advice, especially at the kind of overarching recommendations level about what you should do, again, to foster better data sharing. So we culled this from the different parts, and we created a section at the beginning of the document that I think we called foundational recommendations, which looks into the kinds of things that were being repeated from the different groups. And what you're going to see here are recommendations really that are quite familiar. It almost looks like we could have written a series of recommendations on open science here, but it was the other way around. It came out of what was happening within the groups. And I won't go through them all, but you can see, with number one, it says coordinate cross-jurisdictional efforts, and I think cross-sectoral is also important, as Priyanka mentioned at a related BOF meeting yesterday, to foster global open science through policy investment. Now, this is huge, right? So basically it says, find ways to make the world work better together. But it's really true. And I think, if there's anything we can do in this moment that's positive is to use, I guess, in a sense, our knowledge that comes out of this pandemic to really try to address the larger systemic and global things that need to happen. So this would be a recommendation, of course, that goes to governmental level or perhaps funder level. And then, number two is things like data first policies, try to get the data out there as soon as possible, incentivize that publication, awareness that these things are linked to one another. It's not just tell people to do X, but provide ways to make it easier for researchers to do that or to incentivize that kind of work. The FAIR data principles appeared quite a lot. In fact, they came up in all of the groups that we were looking at in some way or another, often explicitly mentioned as such that FAIR should be promoted. So this made it into well, I wouldn't call this the top 13, but that's what it looks like here. And then there's many more that you can look through here in terms of, use of trustworthy data repositories and persistent identifiers and all the rest. So those are some of the higher level recommendations. Okay, have some of my vitamin water here. So to wrap it up, the part that I'm on is there was this large document, but of course there were a number of outputs that were happening concurrently and also subsequent to that publication at the end of June. And when I was thinking about them earlier today, I realized that they're quite extensive. So some of them are complementary outputs that came out at the same time, such as the Zotero library. It's an output in its own right, but it fits in with the work that was done within the document and supports it and provides easier ways for people to find those resources, those publications. Some of the work that was done is really around dissemination. So there's a policy brief for funders that we released recently and also brought to the attention of the RDA Funders Forum last week in one of the early plenary meetings. So that again is a method for disseminating the recommendations themselves, but putting them into a reduced document that focuses on things that funders specifically can do. And there are a lot of conferences that we were involved in. Anne, who's one of our co-chairs, got us involved in the Euroscience Open Forum. And in fact, just today, this was a couple months ago, but today the YouTube video for that was released. So when you get these slides later, you can click all of the links to see this kind of thing. Then there were navigation tools, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then there's also been kind of extensions of this work. So a number of the subgroups have continued to produce additional outputs. Epidemiology and legal and ethical in particular have some papers out. And there's also some new directions. So there was a BOF yesterday on infectious diseases, which in fact Priyanka was saying she thought of before this pandemic, but then suddenly it became a very clear and important thing to do once we had gone through it. So that's just a few of the things. Oh, and also just yesterday, I think a number of us had worked on an open letter, which was essentially a kind of summary document of this 143 pages, and that was just published in Welcome Open Research. So you can find that through the link. I won't say much more on this because afterwards, after me, Louise is going to speak actually to one of these kind of extensions or papers that is taking a critical look at how this document itself and this process came together. What I will do is just tell you a little bit more about two of the navigation tools because they've been developed considerably since the early days that they were put together. One of them is the COVID-19 DS Wizard. And what this does is it takes the recommendation and guidelines, so it's the same text, and it kind of duplicates this as a series of questions that can be kind of divided into different stakeholder groups. So what the wizard enables you to do is to select parts of the complete document that are applicable to your situation or stakeholder group, asks you a number of questions to quickly try to get you to the content that you're looking for. And then you can download a PDF with exactly that content. So the goals of this are, one, obviously to ease the navigation. We had lots of discussions in the group about whether we should be releasing something that's as long as 143 pages. Will people read it? And we decided that, in fact, people would read the sections that were relevant to them. And I know there are some champions out there who have read the entire thing. We heard about this recently, so that's great. But those are people that are probably working on the data cider thing or working quite broadly across these areas. But also, we also wanted to encourage other like specific domains or national jurisdictions to take this wizard and clone it, because this is something they can do. And then they can add text and resources to personalize it in a sense to their context. So for example, if you're looking at funder recommendations like Mark and want to see how that would link into Canadian funding possibilities, then you can do something that adds that. And there is an opportunity with this software to merge everything back into one version later. Here's a screenshot of what it looks like. So you can see there down the left-hand column, there's the different stakeholder groups. So we have guidelines for researchers highlighted here. The question is, will you be reusing existing data? And then you give your answer, and then it pops up some of the sections that come out of this 143-page document. So significant work to sort of break it all down into these different pieces and be able to feed it back to the user in bite-sized chunks. So that's one. And then the other one is the COVID-19 mind map. And this is a kind of view again of the recommendations and guidelines using a mind map approach. It has the full text of the recommendations and guidelines appended to it as notes that are attached to nodes in the map. This will make more sense when I show you the image. And it corresponds to the questions from the DS Wizard version. So this is intended to provide a high-level view to help you navigate and drill down and find out what's in the document. And then you can filter nodes by tags, such as stakeholder group, section, or topic. You can do a full search and so on. So here's what that looks like. And I know this is kind of small on the screen. So especially if you have your camera off, feel free to bring your face right up to your monitor and squint, because that's what I'd have to do to actually read it right now. So you can see we've got COVID-19 recommendations in the middle. And then, for example, it splits out into the different areas and to the right. And then if we drill into that, here we see, we've zoomed into the recommendations for funders on the left. And then it goes into writing calls for proposals for COVID-19 research, breaks into different areas. And then on the right, if you can see that top bubble is highlighted in blue. And this is about funding proposals that potentially include research with data from Indigenous peoples. And when you click on that, then you get the notes at the very far right in that kind of light blue-gray color. And again, you can read what is in the document. So I know this is very small. This is just meant to give you a bit of an overview. But you can find, oops, I've moved to yours already, Louise. I'll leave it there and not click anymore. If you go to the page called the value of RDA for COVID-19, all of the links are in here, and I'll paste it actually into our chat when I stop talking. If you go to that page, you can see links to almost everything that I've mentioned here. And if it's not there yet, it will be soon. Okay, so that's the end of what I was going to say. Mark, do you want to do questions, or do we want to move on? I'll send it back to you to chair.
Well, why don't we just maybe if there is a question, we've got a couple minutes before Louise comes in. Any questions for Natalie? Okay, I think we can go ahead with Louise then.
Louise, do you want to share your screen so you can click, or do you want to take a chance on me clicking?
I'm very happy for you to click if
Okay.
probably going to be easier. So thanks everyone, and thank you to the chairs for giving me some time on this. My name is Louise. I'm one of the two coordinators of a paper that's come out of the work of the COVID-19 working group that was specifically looking at focusing on the community aspect of the paper. So not necessarily looking at the communities involved in the COVID research, but rather the RDA community and how it mobilized itself towards producing this amazing document and all the outputs. So Natalie, if you could click, please. Super. So as I said, the motivations for writing this paper, or thinking about writing this paper to begin with, came out from conversations people were having with each other, where everyone was saying this was such a unique experience. And as Natalie said, it was exhausting, but also very exhilarating. What we recognized was that this was a very unique activity, not only for most volunteer activities, but also within the RDA community, that this was an unusual way of the RDA community mobilizing itself. The group that came together to work in such a highly time-sensitive fashion were cross-disciplinary and also very international. And we were very interested in how these different areas of expertise and these different individuals who potentially had no prior relationships with each other came together to work collaboratively. It was also very interesting, as Natalie said, that it was the actions were structured in sub-working groups, but these working groups were very non-hierarchical, yet managed to deliver a considerable amount of outputs in a short space of time and created consensus building outputs, so that there was a lot of agreement and iterative discussion within these groups. As I said, it was a short space of time with a large number of participants. So how all these different individuals came together was very interesting. So what we decided to do was to write a paper that really looked at understanding the key characteristics of this effort, particularly looking at the motivational aspects for how and why people came to be involved in the activity, how they maintained commitment and engagement throughout the process, because it was quite a few months from the start to the finish of this working group, what work practices evolved in the different subgroups, and how consensus building occurred within these different groups. We wanted to not only frame it in terms of understanding what happened in the working group, but also to provide recommendations to inform future collaborations, because we felt this was an extremely effective way of mobilizing a huge amount of expertise and individuals over a short space of time. And potentially that could be used not only by the RDA in the future, but also by other volunteer organizations to produce effective outputs. And so Natalie, if you could click. We have had, as a group, quite a lot of discussion about how exactly to draft such a paper. Obviously, there's a lot that could be said, and we had a lot of discussion about how to drill it down into something and how to find a theoretical framework that would really help us to unpack these different themes in these different areas. What we came to decide on was to use a new theory as a framing tool called radical collaboration. This came out of some work by Lindsay McGovern in 2018. She was writing on radical collaboration and research data management. And she frames radical collaboration as a means of coming together across disparate but engaged domains in a way that are often unfamiliar or possibly uncomfortable to member organizations and individuals, in order to identify and solve problems together, to achieve more together than we could separately. And we thought that together with bringing in themes of open science, was a good way to start unpacking the actions of the COVID working group. So we were always going to be doing some form of survey, and we decided to design the survey using this radical collaboration as a guiding framework to look at core concepts of this this framework and designing the survey so that we could get measurable variables in themes such as inclusive community, distributed digital practices, and productive and sustainable collaboration. Thanks. Natalie, thanks. So the survey has just closed. The invitation, we were very broaden our inclusion criteria, we sent it to everyone who signed up to participate in the working group, which was obviously 600 members, including the 164 who actively worked on drafting the recommendations. All the participants were self-selecting. We made use of the general communication channels within the RDA, but also publicizing it through our own social media platforms and so forth. The survey was live for 3 weeks, and as I said, it just closed. And we had 69 responses, which we are currently analyzing. So unfortunately, we were hoping to have the data ready in time to present, but good things take time, and we're still doing the analysis. As I said, we aim to produce an analysis of the working group using the lens of radical collaboration and open science in a way to describe the activity. And also, we're hoping that this analysis will highlight recommendations for future rapid collaborations through volunteer networks. That's pretty much all I have to say. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Louise. Any comments or questions for Louise before we move to Priyanka? As I hadn't, we had an update on the efforts of this group, so that idea of radical collaboration is certainly resonates with me in terms of having gone through the collaboration with the 100+ folks who put a substantial contribution into the mix. So this next part, I'm going to let Priyanka introduce, but I am going to suggest that people should feel free to add any notes or comments in response to Priyanka's probing, either in the shared document itself, and the link is in the chat. You can also type something into the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that and bring things that might be appropriate given where Priyanka is in her conversation. So feel free to contribute in any way you want. And if you'd like to say something verbally, use the raised hand function that should be in your participants panel, or turn your video on and wave your hands, and Priyanka or I will pick up that you'd like to say something. Over to you, Priyanka.
Thanks, Mark. So we're aiming to have this session run in an interactive way. And since we've seen a snapshot of the document, and we've seen a summary of what was covered in the document, I think it'll be useful to get some feedback from people now as we reflect on the strengths and the weaknesses of the reports. Next slide, please. Thank you. So how I would like to run this session is to go through the points, reflect a bit myself, and then open the floor for the other co-chairs and other people on the call to contribute if they feel like. Does that sound okay, Mark, Natalie? I think that's an interactive way of doing it. That sounds good. Yeah. Okay. So what is good about the report? So we had a diverse range of contributions from a range of disciplines and domains that contribute to the response. And I personally feel the inclusion of social sciences and community participation really highlights how this problem is just not a health problem. So the pandemic has not just affected the health sector or people personally for the health reasons, but also the economy, global movement, employment, education, everything. And that's why it was important to have a range of disciplines and domains. Does anyone have any comment on that? Have we covered everything? We could have addressed more things. Does anyone have any comments? Mark, Natalie, people who contributed to the document?
I know one of the comments at the very beginning of the exercise, and the European Commission kind of suggested a focus that drove the subsequent conversation. But I know I heard from a few folks that, for example, the broader science of virology outside the context of viral genomics, whether it be the chemistry of viruses or biochemistry, that was one piece that some of the folks suggested could be added. So that's just one that I know I heard. And then I think Anne has a comment, Anne?
Yes, I think in the clinical group, the scope on clinical data was very, very broad. So we addressed, I was the co-chair attached to that group. So we addressed specifically the clinical trials, for example, and then some sub areas, but there could have been many more areas pertinent for sharing data. That was, first of all, difficult to address in an international context because the sharing of such data are very much jurisdiction related. And second thing, the group was not big enough, although it was already quite substantial, to address all the aspects. So there are some aspects related to clinical data that could have been more developed, but that was, I would say, pragmatic choice from the group.
I agree with Anne and Mark both, actually. So Mark, when the guidelines were emerging and we were having early discussions, I think, I don't exactly remember who, but the question of vaccine research was also raised at that point. But just because it was such an emerging space, at that point, I don't think anyone would have felt confident to contribute much at that stage. And I think there's lots of things that have changed in terms of evidence, even from the start, at the start of the pandemic to now. And it's sad that there's a lot of criticism thrown at people when they change opinions, but that's just how science works, right? You change opinions, you change responses, you change policies as evidence emerges. And I think at that point, including vaccine research would have been quite, I don't know how much of that would have then held true at this point. So it should have been included at that point, but we didn't even have a lot of contributions. So that's one point. And as Anne mentioned, clinical research is really, really broad. And there's even observational studies where I've done a bit of my scoping work in my early days. The observational studies, we try to cover that as well, but then clinical is such a broad term. There's so much happening there. Electronic medical records, you could just write one full section on electronic medical records and the inequities around the world where you have EMRs and when you don't have EMRs and what happens there. So that itself is a huge section. And your hand is still raised. Is there anything else that you want to
No, sorry.
No worries, no, all good. Any other comments or reflections? I can see a comment from Romain.
Yes, just to say that I have reviewed the document at the last release. And from my point of view, security issues are not addressed in the different parts of the document. When we don't know how to manage it with sensitive data, and for instance, how to use authentication and authorization of infrastructure services or PID issues for all scientific objects.
Thanks, Romain. That's a really good point. And I think we did cover some of the technical infrastructure component of the response in the software section, and also issues around security in the ethics and legal section. But you're right, there's a lot going on in the cybersecurity space that should be addressed. And again, I think that's a balance between the social infrastructure, and that actually brings me to the first point of what could have been better. So there's the social infrastructure that enables data sharing. So the framework that enables data sharing, the consensus on what needs to be shared under which sort of framework or what domains need to be covered. But then there's the technical infrastructure that actually makes it happen, and makes it happen in a safe way, in an ethical way, and then complies with all the cybersecurity requirements or any other infrastructure related requirements that are required. So are there any other reflections on what Romain said around authentication, authorization, security?
I have a point. Hi, my name is Daniela. I run the Dryad General Repository. We got a massive influx of COVID data. And so, thinking when I was looking through the recommendations, I completely agree. And I really enjoyed reading them. But when it comes down to then at the repository, we're a trustworthy data repository. We have the security in place. We meet all of the metadata and the points in the report. But thinking about the security, we got data sets that were completely illegal, unethical to have received. And it would have been nice to have a segment in the report for this community about how do we address that? Where does the feedback need to go to the institution when we received like full patient medical records, things like that. And so maybe one level further on this, like specific guidance for the trustworthy data repositories that have that data on how we could have better handled some of those situations that we weren't so prepared for.
Thanks, Daniela. That's an excellent comment. And I think, I don't know about other people, but working in this space during an emergency, these, I would call them mistakes, and sharing records that you're not supposed to share or not anonymizing the records enough, that those mistakes actually happen. And that's a big concern, right? So do you prioritize getting the evidence base assembled and you curate the evidence base, but not at the cost of compromising people's privacy and confidentiality, obviously. But then what are the mitigation steps? Because some of my colleagues who are present here, we ran a session yesterday on sensitive data. And then we discussed what are the measures that you can put in place to anonymize. And do you really anonymize any record 100%? That's actually an ambitious and aspirational ideology, but that's not true. You almost never are able to 100% anonymize a record. But then what are the mitigation measures in place? What do you actually do when those kind of privacy breaches or data breaches or security breaches happen? I think that needs to be strengthened a little bit, and that needs to be addressed as well, I feel. And you've turned your video on. Do you have a comment on this?
I think that, well, I'm still following the legal and ethical group, and I can forward this. I don't think there are members of the group in the conversation today, but I can forward this preoccupation
Claudia,
to
I'm
them.
a member of the group.
Oh, yes, Claudia, okay, good.
Yes, so I'm checking to see you speak the truth and nothing but the truth. Especially because it's legal, right?
It is.
So just thinking of time, Priyanka, we may want to move to the next question.
Next question, sure. So the recommendations and guidelines aim to achieve the fine balance between timeliness and sharing information and the quality of information shared. I think this brings back to the comments around security of information and the other points that were raised, that has so we've aimed to achieve that balance, but at the same time, I think that it's a little bit difficult to do that 100%, especially in the early days when getting the information out faster is a priority. Does anyone have any reflections or comments on that? Acknowledging that there is a focus on making sure that the data quality is as good as it can be when it is shared, but the focus is quite strong on the timeliness of sharing information, especially in the early days.
And just to note, as I watch what on my screen is an anonymous quagga, I would again encourage people to put their notes in the document. I'm adding notes as we move through the discussion, but by all means, feel free to add your own.
So there are no comments on that positive reflection of the report. I'll move on to the next one. So the report is a community-led and community-driven effort that evolved rapidly over a short period of time. And I feel that's the strength. We also had regular consultations. We had regular call for comments. We had draft versions where we incorporated feedback from not just RDA members, but from the general public as well. Does anyone have any reflection or comments on that?
The only thing I would no, I wasn't involved in any of the subgroup efforts, which themselves had some pretty tight timelines and a lot of meetings. But I know in working with the co-chairs and the co-moderators, that rapid evolution of the effort was fairly taxing on folks, and I sense there's almost I need to take a break from the conversation sometimes as we have events like this one. But that would be my only comment. Was it was a heroic effort. Then I see Marjolaine has.
Yes, hi. My name is Nazarene. Actually, I have a question more in regards of how community feedback was involved or included in the report. So if I draw back a little bit from yesterday's meeting on sensitive data, I was actually wondering whether the community had given feedback on how they felt about sensitive data being collected throughout the population and shared amongst research groups, and whether they felt that some of the data was maybe more sensitive for them than others. It's really more of a general question, actually.
I think that question also then feeds into the second point in what could have been better, right? Was there sufficient engagement with and participation from the general public? Do other panelists want to say anything? Or?
Well, just in terms of the procedure, it was opened up for comment through the RDA website platform. So basically opened up to the 10,000 members of RDA for comment. That's how we did it throughout the different phases. And then we did get feedback though from those that weren't in RDA. So I don't know if it was sent around by others more broadly. Mark, you may want to speak to that.
Yeah, and Hillary, I know Hillary's on the call, but I think there was some direct.
I can partially answer that because Hillary set up a table of all entities and associations and institutions. And I can speak for myself because via the Brazilian Academy of Sciences, it was sent to a huge amount of affiliates and all over Latin America, as a matter of fact, who are not members of RDA. It's just that there was not given, that people were not given infinite time to answer, you see, but there was lots of feedback from non-RDAers. Okay, I tend to invent words.
I just had a comment on that as well, just on a couple aspects. So I think we sent it out just in our little corner of the world, which is kind of a specific human genomics immune response part of the world. We sent it out to our internal community for feedback. So our little corner of the world had some response. And Mark, to your comment about the kind of amount of work involved, I think from, again, my little corner of that document, it was intense but manageable. I'm not quite sure how you editors managed to pull it all together, but from the perspective of writing a small section of it, I think it was very intense. I'm truly impressed by the number of people that were involved and the fact that it got pulled in together a document that was so coherent.
Yeah, thanks for that, Brian. I think, and that's a good example, aside from Hillary and Claudia's and others' outreach to specific types of stakeholder groups, the outreach to domains happened in a few cases, probably not as many as it could, but we also recognize that those were the kinds of folks that would be fully allocated in responding in their national context in particular to the pandemic. So that was also part of the challenge, I think.
Thanks, everyone. I think those comments are really useful and something something to think about. So the last bit is, what is the one thing that is missing from the report? And could be anything, the research area, the cross-cutting themes, or specific guidelines that we could have included.
Maybe something which this is Claudia again, which we are trying to do here, which is what comes next, right? This is not missing from the report, but this is exactly what this discussion is about, I understand, or not really.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a fair assumption to make, that this could have done something that can be done better, or can be included in the future, or part 2 of the guidelines or recommendations. So any feedback is welcome, Claudia.
Anne, can I suggest something? I think there are very little in the report about children, schools, and when you see for decisions to be taken, not specifically for research, but for closing or not schools, are children able to disseminate the virus or not? The necessity for sharing this kind of data is very, very high, as it has many consequences. And I think that this aspect on research on children regarding the COVID were not, there are specific recommendations to do when it is about children. So I think that's an area we have not very much developed. And maybe it would be interesting to do it now. There are more data about that.
And again, oh, I'm sorry, just one more thing that is coming up again and again in the discussions I've been having on this report and open data as a whole is the people in down south, where I am from, Brazil and Latin America as a whole. They are becoming kind of reluctant to deposit their data in the north, okay? Because they say if we start depending too much, if we deposit our data in our valuable patient data, DNA and so on, what happens if all of a sudden new North American or European policies decide to close the repositories? So what kind of policies should be enforced to keep them available permanently, regardless of governments, let us say, or even economic pressure? I don't know if that would fit the report.
Yeah, that's a good point. We've added that.
I don't know if I can come on this point, Claudia, from Claudia. In OECD recommendations, and I don't remember if they are mentioned or not in the document, there are requirements for repositories to have a policy in case they are obliged, in a way, economically speaking, or for other reasons, to close. So one of the criterion for trust repositories would be to ensure that there is such a policy. It is defined what happens if the repository has to close, so that people putting their data there are aware of that.
Can I also make a comment?
Yes, Kathleen, we'll just take one comment.
No, I just I wanted to also respond to what Claudia was saying, because I think it's very important that what should happen really is that the repository infrastructure in Latin America should be invested in and strengthened. And I think the ideal is that the data that's produced in one country can be housed and shared from that country. It's very important. And well, of course, that's what CORE is working on. But the other thing I wanted to say about these recommendations is, Natalie, at the beginning you said, oh, these recommendations could be, they're very high level, and they could be looked at as general recommendations around open science. And so I just think this is such great work that was done, and I wonder, what we can extract from this to generalize beyond just the COVID-19 environment that can be used to advance like data sharing across all kinds of areas.
Just to respond quickly to that, Kathleen, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's those high level ones aren't entirely new, because if you're working in open science, we've heard these kinds of things before. They've been discussed a lot, and there's a tremendous amount of effort to try to implement them or make them more detailed or find the pathway forward for them. But what this opportunity provides us with is the best case study in this possible, right? Like I've often thought about this recently. I feel like we're in a moment where the general public understands that it's important to share research data. It's in the newspapers, it's being discussed. The idea that what did, very early days, what did China learn, and sequencing the genome and like the DNA and all the rest, like from that forward, there's a consciousness. And so can we capitalize on that is what I keep thinking. Because to me, in these questions that Priyanka's put together, it's, when I think of what could be better, I'm sure there's things that could be better in the report. So I'm not saying there aren't, but it's more about the dissemination of those and how do we get them out there and get people adopting them and looking at those broader implications as well, and understanding that if you don't make those investments now, you're going to have the same problem down the line, right? And not just in infectious diseases, but other things as well. So,
yeah.
Priyanka, well, maybe we'll do one more question from Matthew Lucas has his hand up, and then I think Varsha posed a question regarding impacts in the chat, which would be a good segue into the final section.
Great, thanks, Mark. Can you hear me okay? Oh, sorry, can you hear me okay?
yeah, we can now.
Okay. No, I just want to follow up on Kathleen's point, because when I was in the session yesterday on the global data commons, I was thinking about the COVID work and wondering the extent to which the recommendations there are recommendations in general for data commons. And in that session, one of the questions that came up was identifying particular challenging issues that need more work. And I'm just wondering if this work on COVID, if issues arose in the process that you would say require further work down the road, to either directly relation to data sharing around COVID or more generally to make it easier to share data across national borders.
That's a good point, Matthew. Should we move on to the next, or does anyone want to respond to that comment? Any of the co-chairs or editors?
I think it's an important point that is highlighted by Claudia and others. So clearly an element in how we kind of address that moving forward. As Matthew suggests, one of the possible pathways for this kind of conversation to happen is to intersect with other conversations that are happening with other groups. And Matthew mentioned the Global Open Research Commons effort. So again, maybe a good segue into the final kind of two sections, which are not, I don't have slides for them, but they're reflected in the notes document. And it's a little more of the kind of discussion that Priyanka has just facilitated. And it's specifically around how do we proceed. So I'm going to pose the first question, which is, we created an output, as Natalie described. It's a 140 plus page document with other outputs associated with it, like the Zotero library and the DS Wizard and others. So what does the group feel about whether that document itself, for example, considering the gaps that were highlighted in the conversation with Priyanka just now, or corrections or the addition of more updated resources. I'm sure we can all imagine what could transpire there in terms of maintaining the output. So maybe just any comments people might have in terms of the commitment to, so is our commitment to focusing on the larger discussion of the dissemination of the outputs, and as Varsha asks, determining the impact of those guidelines? Or do we put some focus into updating, maintaining the output and its associated outputs? So those kind of two sides of the question, and we don't have to put all of our energies into just one, but it will partly drive the next question, is how do we how do we approach that in moving forward? So welcome any comments or thoughts from anybody on the call.
Mark,
Ingrid.
Ingrid, go ahead, because I was going to talk about data sharing across the ocean, which is already causing legal problems.
Okay, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that, you know, these two strands, of course, serve two different audiences in a sense. I mean, measuring the impact is something I think that is also important for RDA as an organization. So there is a kind of business value there. And the other aspect, making sure that we maintain this work in some way, I think is in a sense, you know, for the good of all, much more important, because that serves the target audience that we have for these, that we envisage for these outputs. So I think on the business side of things, yes, we need to monitor that, but maybe that is more something that we need to take care of within the bodies of RDA. And my feeling would be that the biggest emphasis should be on making sure that we maintain these outputs for the best of all.
Okay, so one comment that RDA and the governance groups would consider how to best track the impact, but maybe a group like this or an evolution would look at the maintenance. Hillary?
So, yeah, I'm listening to some of the discussions, and I think that there are many strands, but they might all come under this, also this communities of practice that we are going to invest in. And I see it maybe in that framework, and maybe we should start to really think, is that the best place to start? Because there are many groups spawning off. There are these activities here, some of them may be brought along. And clearly the maintenance of the outputs requires some special attention, which probably, yeah, would be, I mean, the way the groups, as you all know, work at the moment is that everyone maintains their own. We don't provide maintenance up to a certain point, if you understand. It is in our plans to do so. And this could be, you know, the one with which we experiment. I would see it more within the framework of the communities of practice, with knowing what will happen in the next 6 to 12 months.
Okay, thanks, Hillary. And that's a good segue. I'm going to pose the examples of how we could continue, which follow with the suggestion of 3 possible approaches, one of which includes the communities of practice or community of practice. Claudia, had you wanted to insert something in here before we move into possible pathways?
No, it's just a comment of something we've been discussing in the legal group about the new regulations coming out from European courts about limitations on data transfer from the European Union to North America, in particular the United States. Okay, and how this would affect the sharing of any kind of data, but in this case, COVID data. And Anne, who has been participating in these discussions, can also might be interested in saying something else, but I don't know.
Yes, that's the orientation that the legal and ethical group has been taking. I would say triggered by a decision of the European Court of Justice that came out, I think, in July, so just after completely cancelling the agreement that was existing between US and the European Union to exchange data. So that was not specifically for research data or health data at all, but what the group has worked on is how this affects the transfer of health data and for research. And it's quite difficult for the moment to find a good solution for that.
Okay.
So it's not directly related to COVID-19, but it affects all health-related data. And that was something that did not exist at the moment when the group started. But it's a way of how these working groups actually fit with the actuality, what is happening. And it's relevant to continue keeping the same direction, how to facilitate sharing and what are the current problems and possible solutions.
Okay, so
I have given in the notes the links to the preprints of this paper. It's on Zenodo, at least. So you can find it in the notes.
So a good kind of segue into how we move forward, and Anne's and Claudia's comments indicate that there's separate work ongoing in the context of the legal and ethics group. So as RDA does, it is the community itself that determines the priorities, and those go through a process of creating a use case charter kind of document and moving forward with an interest group or working group. So I'm going to kind of skip forward into the section 4, because I do want to make sure we have a chance to have a fulsome discussion on moving forward. So just to briefly again bring us back to the kind of the status. So the COVID-19 working group was a single working group formed as a result of a request, as Natalie described. That work was substantial, as we've heard, and in order to carry out that work, we broke up into separate subgroups. So these were not kind of formal working groups or interest groups that went through the normal RDA process, but were rather, you could think of them as operational subgroups that made it easier for us to accomplish our work in a short time frame. So that's where we are today. We have this COVID-19 working group, of which this session is a reflection of, and then we have the work that was ultimately materialized in that 140 plus page document that was overseen by co-moderators and colleagues in the subgroups. So I just, as an example, I suggested 3 possible ways of moving forward. Given the conversation that we've just had under options for continuing, the first one I highlighted was consider the work of this working group done and close it. It sounds like the temperature of at least this group is that there are things to be done, whether it's maintaining, adding, enhancing, updating, not just the document, but also some of the others like the Zotero library. The other one is to continue the work of this working group as it is with some or all of the existing subgroups. Continue on with the working group and its existing charter, which may lead to formalization or some other way of moving those conversations forward in a longer term. For example, for those that aren't familiar with RDA's method of operating, a working group typically has a 12 to 18 month timeline to develop outputs. And the work of this working group happened within the space of a couple of months. So I think that normal mode of operation it was a good example of where that doesn't fit the requirement, but it's also a good example of how, I think it was Louise who commented that quality takes time, and sometimes having a little more time to consider these things is sensible. And then the third one, which is an option which Hillary referred to, is to continue the work of this COVID-19 working group and all of its associated efforts under the context of the new, what's called a community of practice. And I put community of practice for infectious disease as a suggestion that it could be a focused community of practice, or it could be a broader community of practice that considers infectious disease, which was a point of conversation in a Birds of a Feather session that Priyanka shared yesterday. And the fundamental difference, if you will, between a working group and a community of practice, of course, is that a working group does typically have a finite timeline in which to do its work. a community of practice is intended to have no timeline. So it's a group of like-minded individuals who gather, as all of our colleagues did on the COVID activity, and facilitate efforts that may well include the creation of interest groups, working groups. So community of practice is a kind of exemplified in the existing RDA community by IGAD, the Interest Group for Agricultural Data. So it's been going along, tickety-boo since RDA was created. And it was used as a body that contributed towards the first draft of the communities of practice, based on the fact that it was a very successful example of what RDA would like to encourage, which is a domain focus through the communities of practice lens. So option 3 certainly doesn't preclude the continuation of a COVID-19 working group, for example, but it does provide a domain focused group, which may encourage more researchers and NGOs and private organizations, for example, to get involved, because it is focused around that particular domain of infectious disease in this example. So there is a framework that has been drafted. The RDA Council and other governing bodies are just finishing their comments and feedback to polish it up and make it public for feedback. But I would suggest that the trajectory of the COVID-19 group and the interests and the intersections with other existing RDA interest groups and working groups speaks strongly to the opportunity of having a community of practice. So with that kind of background, any thoughts or comments on any of those 3 options or this idea of a community of practice? And I did, sorry, I should have mentioned this after the list of people that are on the call. I did put in what is still currently a draft, but it is a table of comparing community of practice to the IG, WG, and birds of a feather, and giving a sense of the differences, at least in the current thinking as the RDA team works through the draft document. So that is there for your perusal at the end of the document. So any thoughts on next steps?
Yeah, Mark, I think I agree with you that community of practice sounds like a good option, but whichever way we go, I think it's worth just thinking about what the risks could be in any route that we take. One risk that I'm very worried about is that this report will now just be fixed and will very quickly get out of date because the field is moving so quickly. So we have to be careful that that doesn't happen. Equally, on the other hand, I think if we try to maintain a report as big as this and as kind of homogeneous as this, we run the risk that we're just not going to have the effort to be able to keep going at the pace we were going whilst producing this report with all the editorial work. So I think whatever we do, we probably have to recognize that some parts of the work will be maintained well and other parts may be maintained less well. So we need to make sure that whatever we do, it's clear to the reader of the report or the outputs, whichever outputs we're working on, the kind of date stamp upon the work. And some of it will be maintained and some of it, unfortunately, probably won't be able to be maintained just because of resourcing issues. So I think we just have to kind of keep that in mind, whichever way we go. We are always limited by the volunteer nature of the work, as it were, and we can only do what the volunteers are able to do. So I think whatever we do, it's likely to have to break up just for that reason, because I'm not sure that we could keep the momentum going. But
yeah,
comment.
Which to my mind speaks even a little more towards kind of a lightweight coordination, facilitation, as well as I think an all-important kind of outreach to potential supporters of this initiative. So there could be, some support for the maintenance piece in particular if our broader stakeholder community sees value.
Yeah.
And I was looking, I saw her logged in earlier because I know on Priyanka's BOF session yesterday, we all had a discussion around the community of practice, and there was a group of 4 of us who agreed to move ahead to do an initial kind of draft of a community of practice. And I see Priyanka, myself, and Claire Austin, but there was one other colleague who I thought I saw on the call. No, I'll pull her name out of my notes from yesterday. But
Wajin? I'm probably not.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
What was it, Natalie?
Huajin.
Wajin, right.
Wajin, yes. Thanks,
I can
Natalie.
spell better than I can pronounce. I guess when I'm thinking about this is very, very pragmatic, but that's probably because I was on the editorial side. We need something other than a PDF going forward, right? Like if we're going to break things into different pieces, and this is probably too granular to discuss right now, but it's worth thinking about how we might do that so that the pieces can move forward at different rates, but that the whole thing can still be findable, whether that's something like the DS Wizard or, you know, or it's another, to use an old term, database type thing. There's probably something we have to think about, which would be a not insignificant piece of work in and of itself, I think, because we'd want to think about how that happens. So there might need to be a small group that looks just at that. You know?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Natalie. We did that group that led to the output of the DS Wizard and the mind map had I would say 3/4 of our meetings were focused on the discussion of how best to reflect a database, if you will, version of the document that would facilitate maintenance. So we never really arrived at I think an ideal, what I would call canonical version of a dynamic document that can organically lead to other outputs. But we got partway there with the DS Wizard, and I think it's just a matter of determining if that is the most appropriate going forward, or we need a wiki type approach or something else.
Yeah, someone's saying in the chat, Laura, could you create a web-based product that would be dynamic? That certainly seems to be more the way to go.
Yeah.
If I may, there's also a parallel discussion, at least in the 2 subgroups I participate in, which is social sciences and legal and ethical, about our intersection with other RDA groups and how we can profit from their discussions and vice versa. Okay, and are we going to stay COVID forever? Or is this going towards general pandemics and crises and things like that? I mean, I'm just mentioning these topics that have come out in discussions about the future.
Yeah. Yeah, no, very important point. I have a comment from Anne, and then I'm going to see if I can, and Priyanka, and then I'm going to move us towards a wrap up.
Yeah, it's short. It's just along what Claudia mentioned. There is a new group, don't remember if it's an interest group, I think, around health data. And there was a session which actually I could not follow, but there has been a circulation of the announcement of this now endorsed group for RDA, and it has many resonances with what the legal and ethical group COVID is working on for the moment with this across jurisdiction exchange and so on. So that's something I plan to mention to the legal and ethical subgroup in the next meeting, because now there is this new RDA group, and which was not officially endorsed months ago, and that can actually be a good way for the interaction that Claudia was calling for.
Okay, anybody else? Or Priyanka, sorry?
Not wanting to derail the conversation, but everything that has been said now has made me think about what happens when the evidence changes? What happens when the legal frameworks, ethical frameworks, and the guidelines on what types of data can be shared, that emerges and changes? So that is something that should be acknowledged in the outputs. It's difficult to keep up with the research. I mean, when Anne made the comment about children and schools, that's one example that has changed so much since March. At one point it was safe and then it was not. And then you could open the schools. Now you need to open schools with different guidelines. So that's the nature of the pandemic, right? It's going to happen. And I know the granularity of the information that could be shared in our region has changed. We couldn't share postcode level data publicly, but now we can. So, but again, it has limitations. So you can share data on the postcode level, but then there's other things that are masked. You can't see other pieces of information because you can put 2 and 2 together and identify people. So those kind of guidelines and changes that happen in data sharing, collection, and what's being shared publicly or not publicly, those things emerge quite a bit. So there's version control, there's timestamps and date stamps that you can put into outputs and documents, but some level of, some kind of acknowledgement that this is going to happen. And we won't be able to keep up with everything, but then we'll try to do that as much as we can, especially when the situation is emerging so rapidly.
Yeah. Okay, so what I'm going to suggest as a, sorry, Claire? Claire?
Sorry, my mute button. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight the development of the new RDA work group, Epidemiology Common Standard for Surveillance Data Reporting, which covers some of the points that were raised during this meeting, certainly not all. And I like the idea of the community of practice as a place where these types of initiatives and offshoots of the from the COVID-19 work group can be inventoried, coordinated, advertised, so that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing, and that we don't work at, just that we try and minimize as much as possible duplication of effort, working at cross purposes and so on.
Thanks, Claire. And so yeah, that you'll find that session later in this week's agenda.
Right. So the case statement is open for public review from October 28 to November 28, and we have a session tomorrow. We have a work session tomorrow at the plenary.
I have a comment from Barsha, and then I'm going to suggest some.
Sorry, one thing I'm just looking at with the guidelines, I think they're really good. And first of all, I just wanted to say congratulations to everyone for getting all of this together in the midst of a global pandemic when everyone's running around being really worried about everything. It would be really helpful if we're thinking about actually having these guidelines to be able to be implemented by the different stakeholders, then could maybe there'd be work done to think about the different stakeholders and what they need to do to implement these guidelines. So rewrite them for publishers, rewrite them for research institutes, rewrite them for funders. Those are just off the top of my head. I'm sure there's other key stakeholders that we would be thinking of. And the point of that is to actually start implementing these guidelines and have these guidelines and all this work that's been done actually start making an impact on the world and how things are done. And I think someone else put the point in as well. It's not just for a global pandemic. These are kind of open science guidelines. So maybe anything that we think is really important, like maybe climate change and climate science, should also be subject to these guidelines. I think that would be great to see.
Okay, thanks, Barsha. And I think Barsha raises a very important point, which I know RDA Council and other bodies have had a lot of conversation about. The DS Wizard was our kind of initial attempt to allow a funder or infrastructure provider to kind of log into an environment that would allow them to kind of pick the components that they feel from the guidelines are relevant to their stakeholders and produce a contracted version of those guidelines. But I think clearly we need to to do better, not only in terms of how that's done and how it facilitates additional work, but also, as Barsha highlights, how we measure the impact. So no solutions in the 4 minutes we have remaining. I will remind people, I see Fotis and a couple of others have just added their contact info to the form. That's very useful, even though we will have, I hope, a list from the StreamPoint team of all the people who logged into this session. It would be very useful for us in communicating back to everybody about the next steps. So I'm going to suggest that given the conversation, I think we have a good consensus that having some kind of having a community of practice, and I'm going to say on infectious disease with the work of the specific COVID-19 working group maybe being facilitated in that context. So Huajin Wang, who's from Carnegie Mellon, Priyanka, Claire, and myself are going to be having a meeting coming up. The reason why we picked 4 was just to make it easier to get an initial draft done up based on the detailed framework that the RDA has put together. So I would, if there's 1 or 2 other people that would like to join us in that effort, then feel free to put your hands up or indicate in the chat before we leave the call. Otherwise, I think the most important next step that I would identify is that we will communicate back with everybody, including all of those who participated in the COVID-19 working group effort. And at some point in the near future, all of the RDA colleagues to get feedback on a draft for a community of practice. So that would be, I think, the key next step. Any other thoughts or comments on how to move that forward, or anybody else that would like to join that smaller group?
Just a note as well about the table, like if you're putting your name in and you're interested in going forward and you have specific things, because I was just having a chat with someone who has experience with the kind of web platform we might be able to create, just note it somewhere. We don't have a column, but note it somewhere in there, because that could help.
Comment or
Yeah.
Good idea. Yeah, and I think most people that get involved in this community like to talk about tools and standards and approaches and infrastructure. So I think that certainly proved to be a natural magnet for a lot of people in the decision tree group, as we called them, and which is why we at some point in our conversation had to arrive at a tool to use. So not seeing any additional volunteers for the smaller group, then we will again commit to communicating back sometime over the next, I'll just say before the Christmas holidays, with all the busy schedules that folks have. And so you can expect an email from one of us with at least an initial draft and probably a suggestion or a doodle poll for a meeting. All right, Priyanka or Natalie, did you want to add anything before we close?
No, am I muted or not? Can't see myself.
No, you're good.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think I said enough at the beginning.
Okay,
I wanted to thank everyone. It's been a really good discussion today.
I'm sorry, Mark, I just missed the small group. What's it for? I forgot. I was not paying attention. I'm so sorry.
To move ahead with the next step, which would be to draft up a discussion document for a community of practice in infectious disease.
Okay, I'll think about joining or not. I have to think about it. Okay. Thank you. But in principle, I'd like, I don't know whether I'll have time, that's all.
No problem. And if anybody else is interested, send me a note and we'll move that forward probably next week. Okay, thanks everyone. And thanks Priyanka and Natalie and Louise for contributing to the session, and look forward to the next step.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.